Okay, everyone ready to get going? My name is Matt Walker, and the presentation I'm giving today is creating a mobile game plan to work with large brands. This is the first time I've ever done this, so if I mess up or whatever, just bear with me. So I work at ESPN, and I design fantasy sports. I've designed that for about 7 years now. And in that time, I've worked on a large number of different things, whether it be print, mobile, sales, ad solutions, things like that. So I've come across a lot of different things as the web has grown. And the idea is that my talk today is to kind of relate to you with things that you might be going through. I've gone to a number of these conventions before, conferences, and a lot of times I always feel like there's a lot of things like, oh, you can't do this, you have to do that, and don't even start a project unless you have X, Y, or Z. And I always sit there saying, well, I don't know about these people, but I have to do whatever they tell me to do or I'm going to get fired. So I'm not going to say, hey, I'm not starting this project, I don't have the proper materials. So my talk here is to kind of explain to you what I've seen and some of those challenges that I feel are maybe a little more real world. And if you work at a smaller agency or a third-party company that's going to work with a big brand, or you're looking to get into a bigger brand like an ESPN or Disney or whatever, these are just some of the things that would probably be helpful. And the other issue would be, for me, would be to just to kind of show you in general some of the things I've learned along the way with mobile and branding and so on and so forth. So here's just sort of a mishmash of logos and products and things that I've developed over the last, 4 or 5 years or so, just to kind of give you a breadth of understanding of just sort of styles, products, and the different sort of realm of things I've worked on, just to maybe give you a little idea of where I'm coming from. So again, who am I? I work for ESPN Fantasy Sports. I pretty much have designed every game, every ad, every sales packet, from small to big on a daily basis. I've had teams of 5 people. I've had up and down with just myself. But in the end, I've art directed and designed pretty much everything there, with the exception of commercials and print ads and things like that. I have a lot of expertise in mobile and web and logo and UX design. And UX design is something in the last few years is something that I probably have the most pride in, and also I feel most comfortable saying. Because I feel like at this point, having known this user for now 7 years, and also seeing how mobile has grown and seeing when things had started, whether it was just e-commerce or internet marketing or whatever, I feel like I'm at a level now where I can talk comfortably about how people react, how they respond to things, in my experience, and just kind of start from there. And I think as a designer, there's a big difference between being a UX designer and just being a designer. To me, being a designer, you could just literally cut and paste and move things around or just repurpose things, but a UX designer is a lot different. A UX designer or a product designer is really someone that gets to the heart of the issue and says, why does it work this way? Why do I want to open this app, use it every day? I mean, it's great to build something that looks really nice, but what about tomorrow? Will I ever open it? There's a lot of apps out there that you open and they blow you away and they're great and you're like, this is amazing. And then you never use it again, and then 3 months later, you're just like, I'm deleting this thing. I can't have all this crap on my phone. So that's the worst thing you don't want to do. You don't want to be this beautiful app that no one has ever used. And that's where I think the UX part of it really comes in, which is, why do they need it? How does it enable them to do other things? Is it a first screen experience? Is it a second screen experience? In the case of ESPN, a lot of things that I design are enhancing something else. So the whole idea of fantasy sports is we have this great thing of sports that everyone loves, but now we made it more interesting. And so most of the people are spending their time watching something and holding my product right here or whatever. So keep that in mind as you're building it. You know, are they using their thumb? Are they using their finger? Are they sitting down? Are they immersing themselves in it? Or are they just making picks on their daily pick-up game at the bank? And why and how are they using this thing? And that's where I think you get really into the depth of being a UX person as opposed to just sort of an aesthetic designer or a flat web page designer. And then again, you know, I'm just a designer like anyone else. I was at one of these in Portland earlier this year, so I'm no different than anyone else here. I'm just, for some reason, they let me come up here. So I'm going to take advantage of that and talk and share my ideas, and hopefully at the end someone gets something out of it and feels pretty good. So one of the main reasons that they thought that I might be able to provide some value today is we just launched the ESPN NFL Fantasy Football iPad app. We launched this probably mid-August. And this is the product I've spent the last year working on, and we're really proud of it. And it was a big step for a lot of reasons in ESPN. One of which is that there's a big shift. And in the past, most of the stuff we did in mobile was outsourced, or you know, this sort of side group would do mobile work, and we would just sort of work with them, but there wasn't a lot of ownership. So consequently, there wasn't really a feeling of connectivity between the phone and the iPad and then the desktop app. And the problem is, if we use the ESPN iPhone app right now, it's in my opinion, it's not that good. And what we need to do is, as we're taking ownership of mobile back, which I feel like a lot of large companies are, is we have to figure out how we can sustain this while still owning this desktop thing, which owning the phone, and now, you know, the smaller iPads coming out. And that's something I'm finding in a lot of bigger companies, which is there's so many things we have to work on all at once. And do we have the bandwidth to just not work on one thing and make it good, but maybe work on, you know, 7 or 8 things at the same time? And I think that's something that a lot of companies are starting to see, is you just can't outsource mobile like this in this grand degree anymore, because a lot of these things that are outsourced feel like such a different product. And a lot of times that product just looks nicer than your real product. And then now all of a sudden you have a competition within yourself, and you're not even building something that is a consistent, you know, every screen experience. You're actually having your stuff competing against each other. And now I'm saying, it's desktop. It just doesn't work well. So this was a big step for us to build this, because the internal people, it was myself and only a few others, where in the past it was a lot more. We sat down and we ripped this thing apart, this fantasy football engine that we use, and we just sort of said, okay, what can we take away? What can make it better? What can we do to make this a good experience that's continuing on top of something which is very successful, but improving on it, and also not scaring people off? Because one of the things that people really hate change. If they love fantasy football and I messed up that experience for them, they're going to be very, very angry. And so you're sort of the owner of this experience that people take very, very seriously. So it's sort of this tightrope that you have to walk when you're building a product like this, which is, how do I make something that's interesting, that's fun, that does what it's supposed to do, but I can change it enough to keep improving on it, without having people completely melt down. So what you see here is sort of a compromise of sorts. And then if you had looked at our original sketches back in last time, it was something very, very different from this. It was actually very extreme. It was more horizontal, and there was a lot going on. And over time and testing and things, we sort of brought it down to this event. But what was great about doing it in that sort of iterative way was, when we went to relaunch and we were feeling like it wasn't doing exactly, you know, the additional work we wanted it to, we were able to go back to that original drawing board and pull some of those things and actually sort of make this a better experience at the end. But again, this was a big step for us, because we had to figure this all out. Because before, we just would outsource this. So we're using people that were used to working on the web and putting them into this environment, which is, it's a lot different. It's a lot more interactive, and you have to really question everything because of the size of the screen, the needs of the app, and just a number of different problems that you don't normally have, and then also advantages you don't normally have. So, I'm very proud. It's a 4.5-star app at the App Store. We were #1 for a while. We've had great customer feedback. It's our first internal app. And one thing that was very difficult was we spent about 4.5 months working, and then Retina came out, which is something in mobile which is very difficult. Is you spend so much time going in one direction, and then they rearranged everything, and we had to go back and really almost redesign it, because now having everything double the size, we had to start asking questions that I would Google and they didn't exist, which is it okay to just double the size of my load screen? Well, not according to my developers, who weren't very happy about a huge splash screen that we got to do a repeating pattern, we had to change this. We had to go back and actually question a lot of things that were norm, because no one had actually done Retina iPad apps to this degree, so we weren't exactly, or at least not that they were releasing the information on us. And we had to go and find out the answers ourselves and just sort of cross our fingers after a while. But one thing with the Retina that was a good thing was what I tried to do is bring in more textures and more things to capitalize on the resolution. Just small little things, little patterns, little things here or there. So in the end, you're taking advantage of this new challenge rather than sort of bitching and moaning and saying, oh my God, this is so horrible, I can do this. Looking at it from the other perspective and just saying, okay, well, what can we do here that will really make that part of the shine? And I think that helped quite a bit. And then we also relooked at size of images and stuff that in the old way of doing apps wasn't really a concern as much, but now with Retina and everything doubling, is now something that we're probably going to have to look at a lot more intensely as we would on a website, whereas in the past with a mobile app, it wasn't really as important maybe as it is now. And then, again, this is a big thing because at ESPN, as a group, I worked with the regular folks at ESPN.com, and we were trying to say, what is an ESPN app? What does that look like? Where do we put the settings buttons? Do we have one button for everything? Is there a way to sign in on every app? Do you come in and then you have them sign in? Or do they come in, do they sign in later? Do you let them come in and use the app and then register? Or do they, these are all the things that you have to question and ask yourself that in a big brand like this, nothing really happens in a vacuum or a silo. So you really have to dive in and have an answer for anything you come up with. You should expect to be challenged and say, well, will it work for this? Will it work for that? And you have to say, well, okay, I thought of this, I thought of that. Yeah, and be able to answer, because if you don't answer it quickly, they're also probably not going to trust that your answer is the correct. So I just wanted to kind of put my thoughts on mobile out there in general, just so you could sort of get an idea of where these things are coming from. Again, these are all just my interpretations and thoughts and ideas from my time working on mobile and branding and everything like that, just so that you can kind of get an understanding of whether we agree or disagree, or if you just need to throw whatever I'm saying out. But to me, mobile is really a product, whereas the web wasn't necessarily a product to me, I don't believe. Mobile is a product, because now you're sitting there, and there were things in the web that could be product, but when you get into a mobile product and you're sitting there and you're working with it, because of the space constraints, because of the different devices, you really have to ask tough questions that we probably as designers weren't even allowed to really challenge before. So the higher ups who make the decisions and decide where we spend our time and who goes into the net and who gets beachfront property on these things, they all of a sudden are deferring to us because they don't really understand the mobile part of it. They think they do and they're getting there, but they will acquiesce now more than ever. One thing I'm noticing as I've been doing this for a while is every time something new comes along, you probably have a window of about a year or so where they will defer to you and they'll actually let you make decisions that when they feel like they have all the answers, they'll take that away from you. So you really have some time to make hay while the sun shines and go in there and establish some rules before they have an opinion. But I have noticed that a lot of the people that were designing at ESPN or other places web pages aren't necessarily good mobile designers or good product designers because they don't ask the questions at the depth that you need to ask to create a good product. So when you're sitting there and you're thinking of ESPN Fantasy app, the question again, as I said before, is where are they using this? What are they doing with it? Why would they use it? Whereas on a web page, I know where they are. I know it. They're just sitting at their desk and they're doing whatever. But in the mobile question, it's such a second screen experience that you really have to start digging deeper and going further, and not asking just how to do it, is why did they do it? What could make it better? What would make it more interesting? You really have to talk to people who have differing opinions from you to get to sort of the heart of why they like to do what they like to do. Interactive products require you to question everything, and they really do, because there's 100 ways to use these things. Whereas a web page, in the case of ESPN, it's very flat. It's, for the longest time we were challenged to just copy ESPN.com. But fantasy was always an interactive product, and it was always crazy to me because one is just to sit down and read and look at this thing and say, all right, well, this is the page, I might watch a video, but maybe I'll click somewhere else, and that's about it. With fantasy, there's so many avenues that person could go down that you had to ask how and why, how you can minimize the clutter, make it simpler. Are people using this? Are they using that? Can we make it easier? How do we make it better than the competitor? How do we not just follow what everyone else is doing? I mean, if people aren't even using 4 or 5 of these stat rows, do we even need them here? That's the kind of stuff in an interactive product that makes things a lot more different than if it was just a basic web page where they're really just taking information and not really coming back and forth with it. And a product design can't be dogmatic. And again, one of the things that I had said is when I come to a lot of events like that you would listen to people in the field, what always would drive me nuts is you'd hear that person and you just say, don't do this, and we don't do this anymore, and there's no more doing this anymore. And that to me always sounded so crazy, because there's no answer for anything that is just the answer. There's sort of your best solution based on your variables. But once the variables change, then everything changes. Your results change, your ideas change. I mean, if you have the same feeling about a product today that you do 3 weeks from now, you're probably doing something wrong. You're not getting better, you're not improving, you're not seeing if you can get better and better and better. So when you come across someone that's a very black and white thinker and they think they have all the answers, chances are they don't make good products. Because when you even launch your own product, you never feel great about it. You always have to be questioning and thinking, I can make it better, I can make it better. That's why we have versions 1, 1.1, 1.2. And then, in general, your personal product behavior is skewed. So one of the things that was always frustrating in ESPN was somebody would say, oh, well, I always do this, and I always do that, and I need to have this because I do that, so everyone else must do that. We work at a company that deals with fantasy sports all day. We are not the norm. Most people are at work and they're doing 100 other things. We are so skewed that we can't look at anything that we do as norm at all. If you want to find norm, you talk to your parents to find, in my case, they can't use these products very well. So you see sort of the low end of where that is. Then you talk to your friends that are big fantasy players to see sort of where they're skewing, because that's still not going to be that guy that works with me, because they're interested in the numbers, but they don't know how or why that number's there. You've got to get questions and perspectives from every point of view to build the best product. And if you look at yourself and say, well, I do this, that's probably skewing it in the wrong direction. Before I worked at ESPN, I had worked at, I was a creative director at a women's retail chain, and my boss was, I think she was like 45, and her point was, I'm the customer, so I know what the answer is. And my point was always, well, because you're the customer, you probably don't know what the answer is. Because you're thinking emotionally, you're not thinking logically, and you don't know why you like something in many cases, you just like it. But that's not a way to build a product. I always felt that I had the advantage because I didn't use the product. I could sit back and emotionlessly look at how things were working and make decisions based on that. And then my feeling is mobile first. That to me, right now, solves so many problems that we've had for years in design, which is making people make tough decisions so the product is good. We have situations where, again, working in a large brand, where there's a lot of hands in the pot, and there's a lot of pieces of the pie to go around, and there are people on the homepage that probably shouldn't be on the homepage. There are people, there's this group or that, and you're saying, why do they have such a great placement here? Well, there are people that know people, or whatever it is, and that starts to change the product to the point where the logic system has failed. Are But when in mobile, there's just no space for that. And you have to look at someone and say, make the tough decision, draw a line in the sand. What are our top choices here? If someone's coming here for scores and we're saying scores are number one, then that's one. What's number two? What's number three? We can't just say, well, I promised this to that person, and we do have an ad over here. I mean, that's the stuff where the mobile part of it takes all of that out of there, and then it allows you to make logical decisions because the real estate is so small. And I think that's probably one of the best things to come around to designers in a long time. Is it really put the ball in our court a lot more. And when I say mobile first, at first we were saying that and we're thinking, well, the iPhone or this or that or the other thing. And I said, you know what? The more I think about it, the iPhone isn't really the optimal experience either. It's probably dependent on what you're doing and what you're using it for, but a lot of times it seems like it's sort of a hybrid between what you want to do for the iPad or the tablet and then what you want to do for a phone. And it's somewhere in the middle there. If you kind of keep them both in your periphery, then you can bring it pretty much to any other place. And that's probably the way of thinking mobile first, which is not one device first per se, but sort of a combo of both devices or size constraints, so you know where you can go for your small screen and then sort of your middle-sized screen all the way up to the desktop, which tends to be much bigger. And then, one of my last other things for mobile, and just in general, is start simple but allow for the complex. We have people that need 50 stats for their fantasy products, but most people don't do that. Most people use one or two stats. Now, I'm not going to decide, what most of them use and turn off the other choices, but I am going to find out what the most obvious ones are, so that you're servicing the greatest amount of people, and then let them have access to the most complex stats and information they can have through whether it be a pop-up or some sort of slider or something that allows them to go deeper if they want. But I base it on a very, very simple thing, so that when someone comes in here even for the first time, through the way I'm showing information, they're understanding the UI and how it works and how it plays out. So I made a list of sort of big brand mobile concerns, and again, it doesn't have to be just big brand, it can be small brand, but these are the things that kind of come up when you're working with a bigger company that don't happen as much if you're working on something for a local proprietor, a friend or someone that hired you to make the product for them. There's a lot of different things when you're working with a bigger brand. And one of the top things are subgrants. When you work for ESPN, or I'm sure this works at CNN or Google or whatever, is you have this big brand, and now you have to carve out a brand underneath. But whatever you carve out in that brand underneath still has to work up to that top brand. So in the case of ESPN, they have this nav bar that we have to have on every page. In apps, we don't need it, but in mobile web, we definitely do. So any decision you ever make always has to take into account the larger brand as a whole. Whether it's just sort of the way you talk to your audience, the way you work with them, or in general, just if I have this nav bar here, how do I get them to look at this nav bar where this is prominent, but it doesn't completely throw the top bar away? And you have to consider those things, and those are challenges in a large brand that you might not have to see. I mean, now you go from a thing where you have 4 nav bars to up to 5 or 6, just because you have to take into account these other challenges because you're working under the umbrella of something bigger. And then scalability. Anything you make has to be scalable. It's going to be reused. It's something that has to be able to be opened and closed. And when you build a product, you have to be able to reuse it and repurpose it probably for the next year or two, and then add on to it. Or if you make something tomorrow and it's great, for example, if I made something tomorrow that was a great in-game experience in terms of how it works in football, well, I better be prepared to make that for basketball and baseball and hockey or whatever, because eventually they're going to come and ask me that. So when you work for a large brand, you really can't build anything that is a one-off. It always has to have a bigger sort of scope that can be used, because they will come to you, and if it doesn't scale, it's really going to look down. Ad placements is something that in large companies, I mean, that's what keeps the lights on. And when you look at these great apps for smaller things, whether it's the Paths of the world or mobile apps like that, they're great, and they don't have to worry about that when they don't have those included. So, you know, from a UI perspective, it's a lot easier to build. But now all of a sudden someone comes around and said, oh, by the way, Coca-Cola just bought this thing, I gotta cram it in. That's something you might have to come in late at night and work on that most people don't realize. And there's different types of ads. You have your RLS ads, which are run site ads, which you try to do as much as possible for inventory reasons. But then there's custom ads and things like that. And you have to build it, again, thinking that this is the worst case scenario. If they put this in somewhere else, is it going to ruin all these other games that have going on simultaneously? Branding and fonts and style guide constraints. Again, with a big brand, I can't decide tomorrow I'm going to use Comic Sans. It's just, it's just not going to happen. But in general, even then, I can't probably use a serif font. I can't kind of display information in a way that's really off-brand. You have to consider these things that, even though it doesn't have to be exactly the same, there does need to be a tie-in to something larger. You're always working back to something bigger. And then, just the UX of the brand sub-brand concept. When I first got to ESPN, the main thing was everyone said, ESPN, the magazine, ESPN, the truck, ESPN, the this, ESPN. And they're like, no, every logo, every brand has to be ESPN and then something underneath. And I said, well, that's great when you're on TV or you're in a magazine that has not ESPN. But once you're in the ESPN world, you've got to carve out a space. You can't have 70 logos that just say ESPN, ESPN, ESPN. So when you do that, you have to think, well, how do I create a sub-brand that isn't countered, but I'm carving out my own space as well? And then I'm also sort of reinforcing the overall brand goals, which are, the market, how old our people are, or the types of interactions they're going to have, or things like that. You have to stand out in a way that you're carving your own path so everyone knows you're an ESPN fantasy product, but it still can't be countered to anything else going on, which is a lot of work. You've got to go back and meet with the other groups and make sure, even though you're not exactly working with everything they're doing, you're kind of apprised of it and you're keeping up with them, and you're sort of working along with them so that there's nothing that's sort of counterintuitive. And then time constraints. In big companies, we don't have a lot of time. It's not uncommon for someone to come up and ask me for a logo in a day or two, whereas if I were to outsource it, they'd give me 6 weeks. It's when you're in these internal large companies, you don't have the time to work on things that they do. And because it's a marathon and not a sprint, you have to be able to build things that you're proud of that don't hit a home run every time. You got to think more of like a singles and a doubles hitter than a home run hitter. You have to be able to go up there and build something knowing that you're not going to be 100% happy with it all the time because you didn't have the time, but you're very proud of it, it works, and it's something you can build on. And you try to learn what the turnaround times of your projects are so you can sort of factor that in, so when you're not working on things, you have things in the back of your mind that you can pull out. My old mentor used to call it a bag of tricks, so that you can hit your time constraints and make sure you're still making good products even though the timeline might not allow for it. And then, internal versus external development. When you're building something for a larger brand, sometimes you can outsource, sometimes you can insource it, but like, who's working on your project with you? What are the constraints? Is it a one-off? Is it something that has to work with legacy code? Is it something that's going to be able to work in the templates in your content management system? It's just something that you have to consider when you're building something, because if it doesn't work, then it doesn't scale, and then you can't use it for something else. You're going to get in a lot of trouble with the people who make the decisions that you build something and spend time on something that's never going to be able to be repurposed. So the other things to consider with a large brand that might be a little the same, might be different, is the devices. You really have to be careful what device the larger brand supports, where you want to spend your time, what you want to build. In our case, we have a mobile web that's very different than anything else we do. I'm not even sure in the reporting structure who makes those decisions, why, and where it comes from. But you have to be understanding that if you build this perfect thing, it's going to have to squeeze into the template system for the mobile app. It's going to have to work for the Droid. It's going to have to work for like 4 or 5 other things. Or even if you outsource it to a third party and they base it on your designs, when they have their questions, they have to work back to it. So you have to think these things before they even come to your front door as you're building them. And then responsive is something that, in a perfect world, is a really good solution for a company like ours, because you say, well, if you don't have the resources and you don't have the ability to kind of react, a responsive solution is great. You build it once and it works. But the problem with responsive in a company our size, and this is a lot of people here might not agree with me on this, but I'm not sold on responsive yet as a true solution. Because to me, even though it works well, in a site like ours, which is, got a lot of depth and a lot of content, and then you have a lot of different sub-brands and categories and things like that can't all be turned around all at the same time, can you do a half responsive site? Can you do something where, this part's responsive, this part isn't? Our old code won't allow it, and, we're not going to spend a lot of money on the horse racing section, so, we're going to have to leave that how it is. So is it a solution that you can use? And so then there's a term we use internally, which I'm not even sure that it's really a term, that we say, is it responsive or is it theoretically responsive? Which is funny because we probably aim towards theoretically responsive, even though it's probably not even a thing. But theoretically responsive pretty much means that without dragging and sliding the screen, we are actually going to assume the space and assume what the constraints are and build it towards that with the idea that it looks like it all started at the same place. So when I'm building a page, or I'm building an app, or I'm building something, even though I'm building the iPad app, I know, like when we built that fantasy football app, I know how that's going to work for the iPhone. I might never get to use it, but again, the theoretical responsive thing is, all right, how would we do this with this nav? How would we show that in an iPhone? And we might just draw it up on a piece of paper or something quick, but you got to think through that period, and that again becomes like a theoretically responsive situation, because from a scope standpoint, you're just not going to be able to accommodate all of the different pages, and there's thousands of templates, and we just won't be able to get to them all at the same time. Another thing to consider with branding in a large company, not branding so much, but with UI, is color. Something I don't think people give enough attention to, especially if you're working with like a UI that is interactive, is color really needs to be important and consistent, and then it has to work back in a big brand. It has to work back to the small brands as well, which is, we're ESPN. A lot of companies say, all right, you're ESPN, so your header link color should be red. All right, well that's great, but red generally means either a negative thing or needs your attention, and you've got to react to it. And the problem at ESPN is that they've done that in some areas, but now you go to fantasy, and red absolutely means something horrible is happening, and you can't have it happen anymore. So one of the things that we sat down, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, and we just said, look, one of the things of consistency that we want to have here is red has to mean something on every page. And if we want to have different colors of red because it's our brand or whatever, fine. But it's got to be darker. It's got to be obviously different. Green has to be much different. Yellow means something. Because that's why when you change from product to product or brand to brand, people say, oh, I know how that is. I'll just hit here, I'll hit there, because obviously that's yellow or green or red, and I got to react to it. And I think sometimes with color, people get so stuck on the color palettes and what they're doing that I think what happens is they forget that it's more important to have your colors mean something in the context of behavior than it is from a brand perspective. And if you do something that's too colorful and too loud, it can overpower your messaging colors. And that'll lead to a bad experience because you really need to kind of hold those things in your pocket. So when it's really vital and important to reacting to something, you throw it down, and you throw that color down, and people know what it means. And I think, again, it has to work back to the bigger company, and it has to be something like, all right, now fantasy says it's this, now we got to go back to the big brand and say, hey, we got to make this work together. We can't have you using gold and browns and all these weird colors if it means something completely different to us. And we need for it to mean something because we have an interactive product. And then one of the things that's kind of tough with working for large companies, sometimes you get really odd brand requests or odd, you get things where, you know, somebody went to a conference and they heard something and now all of a sudden this has to be included. Or in our case, there's this thing called the ESPN bottom line. Spelled it on here. ESPN bottom line is a ticker that's at the bottom of all our screens. And for some reason, the people at ESPN are gaga over this thing. And I think it is the dumbest thing of all time because it made sense at a time in TV when it wasn't interactive and it was a nice way to keep on top of everything. But to me, it's so counterintuitive to the web or to alerts or to anything interactive. Why do I need this constant thread of information at the bottom if I'm already like 3 levels deep into the site and I've already decided I don't care what the WNBA score is right now, I just want to make my fantasy trade. And in mobile, it's become tougher because you have such little space. And because of the way it works, and it's like, yeah, just tack it on the bottom. Well, then all of a sudden, because they did that, they're saying, well, okay, well now we'll never have a bottom navigational system on any of our devices because we have to have this bottom line, which, by the way, we have no metrics to see if anyone even uses it or if they need it or what they misinformed about. So that's the kind of stuff you just have to adjust to because at the end of the day, even though it might not be logical, it's you know, your boss told you got to do it, you got to do it. And that, I'm sure in every one of your companies, there's like head scratchers where you're like, well, you just got to do it, we got to make it work. We'll work around it and we'll just, we'll make it not be an eyesore. Then there's other things like nav structure, which, it's very difficult. Like one of the things I loved was on Tap, they had that really cool nav button that you opened and everything opened inside of it, and everyone in the company was like, oh, it's so great, it's great, it's so great. And I said, well, yeah, it's great. But there's no way we would ever be able to implement it because it's limited, and it's, I can't put that four levels deep onto a page and still have all these other things and have it work. At least it would be very, very difficult. So some of the things that you have to kind of give up on are great ideas that can't work back to the big idea. Navigation in particular is one thing that you really have to be cognizant of. Like one of the things we're talking about now on mobile is, we have that left-hand button you see in Facebook, and we call it the hamburger button. Somebody thought it was like a hamburger, and it just stuck. And so everyone calls it the hamburger button. So it's, oh, just throw in the hamburger button. Yeah, hamburger, we'll just hamburger it. But then what happens is you kind of bastardize the whole point of a good nav, because now this becomes sort of a junkyard for every link under the sun, and you're just tossing it in the left side. And I'm like, that's not really the point of the hamburger button. The hamburger button, if used right, can be great, but it still needs to have, a hierarchy. It still needs to make sense. It still needs to have subsections so that you can take something very complex and still give them a way to get in and out of it. So it can be very good, but it has to be something that we use a certain way, and then the other groups use it the same way too. Because if they're just dumping 100 things in there, and they use Sports Center every single day, and then they use ours like once every football season, there could be a conflict there, and then you're going to say, well, then which is the ESPN one? And then that's where you have to call a meeting and talk to them, and hopefully, you can come to a solution to kind of create something that works for you. And then another problem that can arise too is just pre-existing assets, things that you can't necessarily control. When I built the FFL app, one of the great things was I only had to consider football. So there's 32 teams. I could take every logo and I made probably 4 or 5 custom treatments with it. And it was easy. It wasn't that hard. But But working with the people who put the Sports Center app together, their version with that stuff was a nightmare, because now they've got 120 basketball teams, they've got tennis and golf, which isn't even logos, they're people, and then you've got all these things, and the college teams might not even have vector art, they might have like a fuzzy JPEG, and so you can't use a ping, you can't. So these are the things that you run into when you're building something on such a large scale, which is, what is the best of all the worst that I have? You know, how bad are those bottom conference teams' assets? What can I do to sort of minimize it or make it look good regardless of that? And I've seen some of the things we've built where they just repurpose GIFs from the site, and Retina, when Retina came along, it really looked terrible. And I think that's something, again, you have to look at the worst case scenario and then kind of come up with a solution for it. And then the shelf life. You know, when you have these products, how long does it need to last? If you're building something we built a game for like the decision with LeBron, which, you know, it is what it is. But the good thing about it was, not only, well, thankfully, we buried it because no one wanted to know that it happened, but we built the game, and, you know, where's LeBron going or whatever. You could kind of do whatever you wanted because you knew you were never going to use it again. But you need to know, is this the building block of something bigger? You know, how many times have you thrown together a design to pacify someone thinking, they'll see this one, they're going to pick mine, and then they pick that one, and you're like, oh shit, what do I do now? Sorry. But the point is like, you can't just throw that out there. You can't throw out a bad solution because that's always seems to be what they pick. So be cognizant when building these things that whatever even your worst case solution is, it has to be, you know, flexible to sort of just keep building and moving on and being able to, because I did a mini games thing years ago. It's still there 4 or 5 years later. I had no idea it would live that long, but thankfully it was good enough that even though we're not crazy about it, it's still, you know, it's productive and does what it needs to do. So I hope my ramblings were of interest to anyone here, and I put this together with just sort of some random thoughts that I thought would be valuable. I didn't know if anyone had any questions or anything they wanted to talk about.